and welcome to the Learning Co-op channel Teachers Talk, where we engage in conversations with educators on various subjects. In today's episode, we will talk about homeschooling with Dr. Cheryl Fields-Smith, Associate Professor at the University of Georgia. I hope you'll enjoy this informative conversation. As always, if you appreciate our work, please like, share, and subscribe, and also let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Linda D'Argenio, and I am a world language teacher and translator at the Learning Co-op. And we are here today to talk about homeschooling with Dr. Cheryl Fields-Smith. Dr. Fields-Smith is an associate professor at the University of Georgia's Department of Educational Theory and Practice. And prior to earning a doctorate from Emory University in 2004, Dr. Fields-Smith served as an elementary school teacher in Bridgeport, Stamford, and Norwalk, Connecticut. During her tenure as a teacher, she taught in 2 magnet schools, both of which employed the Bank Street model, which emphasizes child-centered, hands-on, experiential learning through thematic, social studies-based integrated instruction. So welcome, Dr. Fields-Smith.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you just start by telling us why you became interested in homeschooling?
Sure. My dissertation was focused on Black families' engagement in their children's education. At that time, most of the literature suggested that Black families didn't care about their children's education, or there was a perception that they weren't engaged. And that wasn't my own personal experience. And so I wanted to document and see through the dissertation how Black families define their engagement. Mm-hmm. And in that process, when I became a professor at the University of Georgia, I wanted to replicate my study in the same 5 schools, but this time with younger parents. But I discovered that the older parents who were in their 40s and 50s did not really know or socialize with the parents who were in their 20s and 30s in the same schools. And I was having trouble replicating my study. And someone referred me to an African-American woman who was 32, which fit what I was looking for my study. But this time, this person was homeschooling and asked me, would she be a good person for my study? And my thought was, well, wait a minute, I didn't know Black people homeschooled. So I would really like to talk to her. And that was a 4-hour interview. It's the longest interview I ever did. I was just really natural and naturally curious. And the mother was very generous with her time and giving, answering my questions. And so at the end, I asked her if she knew anyone else that was Black and homeschooling, and she started rattling off these names and groups. And I said, okay, I have to get some money to do a big study on this. And that started me down the path of researching Black homeschooling, really out of a sense of just curiosity and really wanting to honor the decisions that they were making as families not to be engaged in their public schools and why. Mm-hmm. I felt like by hearing their perceptions and experiences in the public schools, it was constructive feedback for what's going on in our schools that these parents don't want to be in them. Mm-hmm. And so that started me down the path. I got a Spencer Foundation small research grant to do a 2-year study. And I had 46 different families, Black families represented in that study. And I've been pretty much researching Black homeschooling ever since. Yeah.
That sounds very, very interesting. We'll go back on that that topic. But can you maybe talk a little bit about the educational approach of homeschooling and how it differs from the traditional model? If there are any underlying principles, of set of beliefs that inspire families to homeschool their children. And then obviously, also if you can shed some light specifically on the African American perspective.
Absolutely. So homeschooling in general refers to when parents decide to assume full responsibility for all the decision making regarding their children's education. And they make decisions outside of traditional schools, public or private.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be a mom and a dad working with their children at the kitchen table. But then today, there are a whole lot of ways to approach it. They can use co-ops, they can use learning pods. Unschooling is an approach that they can take. And some families even do world schooling, where they travel around the world or they travel around the country as their children's learning experience is based on that travel. Some families today are outsourcing to online groups. So if there's a subject that I'm not comfortable with as a parent, then I can find someone online teaching it, or I can hire a certified teacher to teach that subject. Or there are even homeschool schools where it depends on the laws in each state, of course. Like here in Georgia, there is, you can homeschool, how do I want to say this? The way our laws are written, a homeschool parent can hire a tutor to do a portion of the homeschooling. And sometimes what that looks like is a homeschool school. So a homeschool mother can then choose to open her own home or have a facility where parents pay her or him, if it's father, to teach other people's children, right? And still call it homeschooling. I think the primary value here is that in all of our states, there are laws written that say parents have the right to have full autonomy and choice and control in their children's education, as opposed to having to go through your traditional schools. And that's what homeschooling is about, for the most part.
For the most part.
Yeah. So that I would say each family has their own reason or values that lead them to homeschool. There isn't any one reason that people decide. Sometimes there can be religious beliefs, and in those religious beliefs, they identify as being their child's first teacher, and they want to impart their religion. And so they decide, to homeschool for religious reasons. Today, it's not about religion always, though. You can have parents who have had disappointing experiences in traditional schools, whether they're public or private, and they decide that they can do a better job than their locally assigned school or the private school that they were attending. Sometimes parents decide right from birth. And from what I found, when they decide this right from birth to homeschool, sometimes it's because the perception of their assigned local school is so negative. It's poor achievement. The school is under-resourced. It could be a school that has a high record of violence and bullying, and they just decide they don't want to put their child through that. And so they decide to homeschool. So it can be many different reasons that a family would decide. In my research, I found it's not one reason. When it comes to homeschooling among African American parents, the one thing that I would say that separates them from all other groups, particularly white groups, is that their children have had racialized experiences in school that are very destructive and damaging to a child's self-identity. Cultural identity is being damaged. And so the parents feel like they have to protect their children. They have to rescue their children through the homeschooling process. And so that racial climate inside and even the racial climate outside of our schools, just, look at what's happening in our country today. Sometimes the best way to keep your child protected, in some parents' views, is to educate them at home and make those choices to protect them for a little longer period than if you bring them into the public school system or the private school system.
There was something that I wanted to ask you that you just mentioned and it just now escapes me. Maybe it will come back to me. Can we talk a little bit about the idea of unschooling, which is, I always hear associated with homeschooling. And if you can maybe just define it for us and how it is associated to homeschooling. And is it possible to unschool outside of homeschooling?
Yes, so I'm not a home educator. My children went through the public school. So keep that in mind as I try to make these, like if you asked a home educator, they may have different definitions. But keeping it simple, I would define unschooling as an instructional process that home educators engage in, where they focus on their children's interests, right? So instead of being guided by standards and test scores like traditional schools typically do, you're focused on what your child's interested in learning. So if you are homeschooling a child that loves trains, then you will develop your learning experiences around that interest. There'll be books about trains. You will go visit train museums. You'll observe trains. You will read about them, count about them, write about them, paint them. You'll do everything about trains. And it's possible to do this type of learning. As when I was an educator, as you mentioned in the introduction, I taught for the most part in Bank Street-based programs, which followed the same philosophy. Let the children tell you what they want to learn, which to some people sounds loosey-goosey. But in our schools, here's the key difference. We had standards, but we taught the standards in a way that was interesting to the children. So I had very few behavior problems because schooling was based around their interests. If the unschooling would work like this, if your child is interested in the Seminole Native American tribe, like who are these people? Usually it's down here in the South, it's because they're playing for a baseball team or a basketball team that's called the Seminoles, right? And who are these people whose name is on our uniforms? Most curriculum in 3rd, 4th grade, around there, you're learning about Native American tribes. And so you can use this opportunity, even if the Seminoles are not one of usually the standards will have certain groups, certain Native American tribes that are listed. And the Seminoles may not be on that list, but to teach through unschooling, even in a public school system, like a Bank Street program, and people will probably have a fit hearing me mix these things up, but here's the similarity. Yes, I know I have to talk about the woodland Native Americans, and I've got to talk about the Pueblos and others, but my kids are interested in the Seminoles. So that's where I'm going to start the learning.
Okay, so it's a point of entry.
It's a point of entry. And then from there, when I'm introducing other Native American tribes, we will compare them to the ones that we were interested in. What's the same, what's different? I'm going to keep your interest highlighted. So in my classroom, you'll see what we're learning because they will post it. They will draw and write about it, what they're learning. And you can see them making the comparisons and the distinctions. And what a wonderful way to learn, right? Based on where my entry point was, not forcing you to learn about folks that you don't really have any connection to, right? Because we're not in the Southwest, so we don't have access to the Pueblo artifacts and things, right? But maybe we're, down here in Georgia, and we're close to where the Seminoles were, and so are hopefully. But so it's that kind of thing. We're accessing children's interests. It's child-centered. And it's unschooling because it's not the way schools are typically
Conducted,
run. There's also a process called deschooling, where home educators intentionally undo what children have been taught school learning is. So, for example, in school, we have reading block for maybe an hour if we're lucky. We have writing time, we have science. To deschool, you won't have a schedule necessarily. You're just going to start with, what do you want to learn? What is learning to you? And create a pathway. You probably will even ask, how do you want to learn? Ask the child, how do you want to learn about this? And start your own way of learning in that homeschool process, opening it up, because if there was a problem in the school, maybe it's the way school is run. It's not for everybody. Having to sit still and listen to this and that and the other.
Definitely.
You can really tune some kids out doing school that way. And so they will deschool in addition to unschooling.
Yeah, no, definitely, at least for my experience as a school teacher, I can say that, yeah, I agree. Probably the smartest thing to do is to always start from the student's own interests. It's motivational, right? My question though at this point would be, I know that the regulations vary from state to state, but how do you negotiate curriculum? I mean, is there, for homeschooling family, there is a curriculum, right? Even though it's not the same nationwide.
Well, yes and no. So when you look at the state laws, each state, of course, has unique laws, and they're it's very different. Some states are highly regulated with their homeschooling, and they assign a teacher and all of that. And some states are very relaxed, and they just have like, you have to homeschool you have to learn for at least 4 hours a day. You have to cover, reading, writing, math, science, social studies, so basic things. And then that's the extent of what they don't provide a curriculum necessarily, and they don't require a curriculum. So each family will be looking for a curriculum that they want to teach their children. And sometimes, just like their motivations are different, the curriculum will vary. You can Google homeschool curriculum, and you will find that there's Christian-based, there's religious-based, there's African-American-based homeschooling. You can find curriculum focused by topics, by subject area. And as homeschooling has increased, so has the number of vendors that are providing different types of curriculum. There are homeschool conferences, and when they go to these conferences, all these vendors are there, and it can be, from the reports of the people I've talked to, it can be quite overwhelming to make a choice. So a lot of times, to actually select a curriculum, it is trial and error. I've had some parents that say they go to their local Walmart when they're trying to find curriculum for their real young ones, and they'll just start with those products first, basic books. And then as they start to talk to one another, I think that's the key. When you get, in communication, in community with other home educators, they begin sharing. And the more veteran home educators will share what has worked for their children, understanding that what worked for one child may not work for another. And so even a mother of 3 may end up with having to do things slightly differently for each of those 3 children, because they learn differently. And so that's part of the process when you're a home educator, figuring out, how does my child learn? Some of the challenges they face, in fact, is when they try to teach in a way that they learn, but then they find out their child does not learn in that same way. So maybe I'm a very auditory learner as a mother, but my child needs visual support. And so I've got to come outside of my comfort zone and figure out, what does it mean to teach a child who learns best through visual means, or tactile means, or through movement. So you may have to teach in a way that you yourself don't learn.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a learning process for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I find that this is the problem that many teachers face, in their professional
That's right.
life, because we're often not conscious of our own learning modalities,
That's
and
right.
then we have to go into this model of one size fits all, and
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk now a little bit about homeschooling as a general phenomenon.
Hmm.
I was reading that according to the Census Bureau, at the start of the school year 2021, there was an increase in the number of homeschooling family by 5.6%. So we went from 5.4 of US households homeschooling their children in the spring of 2020 to 11% in the fall.
Hmm.
It's a very notable increase.
That's
So
right.
what do you see the reasons for this increase? I know that there are some obvious reasons, like the pandemic, the fact that lots of kids just were forced to move to online learning. But
Right.
is there anything else that has changed in the past 2 years, or is there maybe something that the pandemic has accelerated, that was already in motion and that was accelerated during the pandemic?
Yeah, I would say that homeschooling in general was rising in certain places more than others, possibly before 2020, before the pandemic hit. But I would say that the pandemic itself has exponential, what's the word? Exponentially increased homeschooling. One of the things, because I saw the same, statistics, and one of the things I wanted to know more about is, where do we see these increases? And I wondered if we overlaid the increase with the number of COVID cases and the way school districts and states responded
Mm-hmm.
to the pandemic. So in other words, here in the South, we mostly saw school districts that wanted to remain open and not have a mask mandate. And so there may be many, you may have seen a rise in homeschooling here in the South and other places that had similar dynamics,
Mm-hmm.
where parents are trying to keep their children safe just simply from the pandemic. I know in Washington, D.C., they saw a homeschooling doubled. And last summer, they asked me and other people who have studied homeschooling to come and testify, because they realized with such a drastic increase, doubling of homeschooling in their district, they hadn't looked at their homeschool law since 2008, and they wanted to hear what we have been finding about homeschooling before they, so that they could look at their laws and see if they needed to revise anything, because since so many people are doing homeschooling now. So it was rising before the pandemic. I think the pandemic just caused it to really explode. There were some families that couldn't work during that time. If you remember, they lost their jobs and they could stay home all of a sudden. And so perhaps, that helped them to be able to homeschool. It could be a lot of different reasons. The research will start to come out soon
Mm-hmm.
as we find the people who started during the pandemic, if it's just the pandemic alone
Right.
that caused them to homeschool, or were they thinking about homeschooling all along, but the pandemic made them say, okay, we better do this to keep our children safe.
Yeah.
So it could be a lot of things related to the pandemic. The other thing is, I wonder if they will remain homeschooling.
Right.
I think that if they have found a sustainable way to maintain their homeschool practice, and they see their children thriving in the environment that they've created for their children, I have a feeling that they will stay.
I will say.
But if it's not sustainable, then, or their children are not thriving, then of course they will find something else.
Mhm.
So, time will tell.
Time will tell. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. So what do you see as the main problems with that? I know, I understand this is a very broad question, but let's put it like in a more circumscribed way. What is lacking in public school that homeschooling can provide?
Wow. I think our
I know that
number one problem is, I left my classroom in 1999 to pursue my PhD. And in that time, it was before No Child Left Behind.
Mhm.
And I had full professionalism. I could decide how to teach, when to teach. And oftentimes, in that professionalism, you could walk in my classroom and I taught. So for example, my last classroom in 1999 was a fourth grade classroom in Norwalk, Connecticut. And you could walk in that classroom and not tell what subject was being taught because the children were doing different things. And I'm probably on the floor working with some kids on something else. And the reason for that is because I could make decisions on what children needed and and aligned with their interests as well. So if they needed extra time writing, they could have it. Extra time in reading, extra time in math. So I wasn't teaching, this is the math period all the time. I had math, and some people got extra doses of math during the day because they needed it, right? And so I think one of the biggest problems that we see in our school is teachers don't have that freedom anymore. What I'm seeing in classrooms down here in the South in particular is teachers are told what to teach, when to teach it, how to teach it. They're given scripted lessons. It's almost like they're trying to make it so there's no thinking on, no professional thinking. And the teachers have been trained as professionals. Do people tell doctors and lawyers how to do their profession? I guess the insurance companies try, but anyway, but you know what I mean? But to the point where there's a script.
Yeah.
To the point where if it's October 10th, Monday, and it's 10 o'clock and you're teaching fourth grade, the district expects that you're teaching this lesson and only this lesson. That kind of standardization is ridiculous because it's really ignoring a teacher's ability to determine what's best for their students. And that lack of professionalism is oppressive. And we have a huge teacher shortage, and that's a big part of it. So I think that's a big problem. But in terms of homeschooling and what homeschooling provides, it provides flexibility. So if I have a child who is super brilliant when it comes to math, to the extent that they are 2 grade levels ahead, then as a home education provider, I can get that curriculum to my child and keep pushing them in that regard. And if they are that same child is behind in math, in reading, then I can do things to shore up my child's reading. They have that flexibility. In public schools, we don't necessarily have that flexibility all the time. It depends on how they're structured. It depends on how they're run, the expectations and the freedoms that administrators and teachers are allowed. But what it would take is, that child would have to leave the classroom and be allowed to go to another classroom 2 grade levels above for math, period. And, you could imagine the scheduling and all the problems that would cause, right? That assumes that both grade levels are doing math at the same time. So that would be a logistical nightmare in the school. In some schools, not all. Some schools have figured it out. But I think that homeschooling provides that flexibility to meet kids where they are, to help kids to have learning as discovery, to have learning as just for the sake of learning, not because of a test, not because of a standard, but this joy that we can really celebrate that you posed this question and it may have taken us a whole week, but we found an answer. And we have learned, and we can celebrate that. So the flexibility to have a joy of learning, the flexibility to really negotiate the time, the school day. You know, if my child needs 2 recess periods, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, I can do that.
Right.
I've also noticed that field trips have become limited in some school districts. The money and the challenge of doing a field trip with 30 or 40, 50 kids.
Yeah.
It's harder and harder to do that. But when I homeschool, I can go to the grocery store to do my home shopping, and that becomes a field trip, and I can apply some of the learning that we're doing as we're going up and down the aisles. And so I heard a lot of, in my research, I hear, families saying their everyday activities become learning activities. They're constantly learning, always learning. It never turns off.
Every moment is an opportunity.
Yes.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I mean, that's what parents do lots of times anyway, even if their kids are in school. But I guess once one decided to homeschool, then it becomes more of a conscious choice.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So just a couple more things. I was thinking about the socialization aspect.
Yeah.
That's something that I've heard as a kind of an objection to homeschooling several times. Aren't homeschooling kids, where do they have occasion to socialize, for example?
Yeah, they do. And that, so I find the issue of socialization with homeschool kids to be a myth. I haven't found any evidence of that in my research. And at this point, I've talked to at least 70 homeschool parents. Homeschool parents typically aren't just at home with their kids. Their children are engaged in sports. They're engaged in hobbies. They do 4-H, for example, particularly in rural areas. They're engaged in church activities. They're engaged in, learning about their interests. For example, I've had parents whose children were interested in learning about horses. And so they volunteer at an equestrian farm, and they may, clean out the stalls in exchange for riding lessons. And that way they can explore their interest in riding horses, or swimming. And some of them are highly competitive sports, tennis, gymnastics, swimming, golf. And so during the day, they get to do their training. And again, these laws usually require about 4 hours of instruction. Well, you can do 4 hours of instruction and then do 6 hours of training if you have to in a day. Yeah. And they're with other athletes as they're doing it. They're not in isolation doing these things. The other thing is homeschool parents have access to homeschool groups. Where sometimes they get together just to go on field trips together, or maybe they're learning in a co-op together, or in the learning pod together with other families. So they're learning together, and each parent is taking a turn serving as the teacher, depending on what the parents' talents are and interests are. And so they're not in isolation at all. And I know we hear of families that do the opposite, and that when we see that, to me that's dangerous. But many homeschool families, the most that I've talked to, they're out there in the community, they're volunteering in the community, they are doing things together on behalf of their community. These are the families that will call up their local YMCA and say, listen, I have 20 homeschool families here, we have 20 some odd children, and would you do swimming lessons for us in the middle of the day when your pool is mostly empty? And how much would you charge us if we can get X number, So in that way, they're benefiting their community, and they're doing things together. Right. So yeah, I find that to be a myth. They tend to be with children, even with their neighborhood children. who may or may not be homeschooled, you know? Yeah.
Okay. And the last thing, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about how parents or homeschooling parents breach the gap between their own personal expertise and certain requirements, even though you kind of already answered my question before,
Yeah.
I think, right?
Yeah. I think it's one thing that we could note here is that most state laws only require a high school diploma.
Mhm.
That parents only they only need to have a high school diploma in order to homeschool their children. So they might, in that case, if that's their level of education, they are more than likely probably going to come to a point where the curriculum may be a little bit too strenuous, right, for them to teach, particularly in high school. I have 3 degrees. I wouldn't want to teach chemistry to anyone. Right? And so what we're finding today is that you can outsource these things so easily now. With the internet, there are so many places online that you can find a course on chemistry that the children can take. Sometimes a homeschooling group will pool their resources and hire a certified teacher to teach the subjects that they are not able to teach themselves. Particularly, and that's the fact that the teacher is certified becomes really critical when they're trying to put together their transcripts in the high school level, right? So they can do that. There are homeschool schools where there's facilities where you can choose from a menu of courses, and the children can take classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays, they're with their parents to do, So there's all kinds of configuration of homeschooling. And they can find someone to assist where they don't feel, capable to teach a subject.
Right.
Whether online or in person, they can do that. Yeah.
Very interesting. I really like the community aspect of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
That's
So, for families who are thinking about homeschool their children, is there any resource or reading that you can suggest where they can get a better understanding of homeschooling and whether or not it's the right choice for them?
Yeah, there's lots of places today to do that. I often talk to veteran homeschoolers who started homeschooling, in the 1990s or in the early 2000s, and there wasn't nearly as much as there is today. But you can just do a search in your local community for homeschool groups, and you can usually can find a group to start talking to or join social media. The Black Family Home Educators and Scholars is a group that I helped to found. Dr. Khadijah Ali Coleman is running it now, but it seems to be going really strong. They are having their 3rd annual teach-in is coming up in July. I encourage people that are interested in thinking about whether or not they want to homeschool to go to the Black Family Home Educator and Scholars website. You will find information there on homeschooling. You can go to the YouTube channel where you can hear home educators talking about what made them decide to do it. They will talk about how they homeschooled, challenges that they faced. They talk about all of it. Dr. Khadijah and I have co-edited, so I get it right. Yep. This book, it's called Homeschooling Black Children in the US, Theory, Practice, and Popular Culture. And it is an edited book. All of the authors, with the exception of me, are homeschool practitioners, are homeschool leaders, and they're sharing what has made them successful. They share some of their failures. I mean, and when you fail, you are learning, right? You're still learning. There's no such thing as a bad experience.
That's
you learn
right.
from it. And so they've written very powerfully about their experiences starting out as home educators and their joys and triumphs in the process too. And so this is a really good source, I think, for learning about how to get started. Sometimes when you think about it, you have so much freedom as a home educator. Sometimes having that much freedom can be scary. Especially if you are the kind of person that thinks that learning needs to be structured and planned out. It takes time to get comfortable giving children freedom, giving children voice and choice in their learning. And sometimes we do that. We wait until they get older to do that. But kindergartners are actually capable of doing the same. So if you can join up with a community in your local area and just start meeting with them, go on field trips with them or things like that, and ask people about how they got started. Most people are very happy to tell you their story about how they started homeschooling. I think it's when people homeschool, a lot of it is tied to what's happening in their local community. So if your assigned public school is in a place that has become resegregated and is under-resourced, like in these large urban areas, we see that often, then you're looking for other options, right? Because you don't want to have your child go to a school necessarily that is under-resourced.
Right.
And a lot of times people's decisions to homeschool actually reflects inequity in school choice, because they find they don't have any other options besides their locally assigned school, a very expensive private school that they can't afford, or homeschooling.
Right.
And so
that was the one thing that I was going to mention. I mean, public schools have definitely lots of problems. And I was wondering, private schools, independent schools may be an alternative, but one has to be able to afford it though.
Yes, one has to be able to afford it. And even when I had several parents in my initial study that identified private schools that they wanted their children to go to, and they had the money to pay for it, but logistically, it wasn't located conveniently for them to be able to go to work, to drop the children off and go to work. It was too far from them. Right. So sometimes, that's part of school choice. They realize, wow, we have the money, but we still can't physically manage the logistics because the private school doesn't have a bus, right? And so if we don't have all of the things that you need, then you still can't engage in private school. Home educators leave private schools as well. Some of the people that have written their memoirs, Paula Penn-Nemrut, who wrote Morning by Morning, for example, her children were in a very prestigious private school initially, and it was not the best place for their children. And so private schools aren't always the answer either.
No, they're not. Definitely. They're not. Okay, Cheryl, thank you very much for a very interesting and informative conversation. And maybe we'll do it again.
Okay. Anytime. Thank you so much.